Okay, guys, good afternoon. Welcome back. Just getting things set up, but in about a minute, we'll get our class period underway. Good to be with you guys, and hope you're doing well. Hi, Ryan. How's it going? Hello, Danny. Jordan, welcome back. Oh, Brendan, you didn't receive the attachments. Okay, sorry. I sent them, but there must have been some issue here. Let me actually look that up. Maybe I sent too many of them because you had 7 pages, and that could have caused it to say that it was too many for me to send. So that's happened one time before with a different student. Let me double check, because if there's an error message that I received, then I'll know. 1 second, guys. Hold on. Thank you so much. Oh, I didn't get the error message yet, but let me ask you this, Brittany. Did you receive the message with the written content? Okay, yeah, not to worry, Remy, but thanks for letting me know. So, Brittany, yeah, I sent you the scanned images of the pages, but it seems as if maybe some of them didn't come through, or did none of them come through. You didn't receive any attachments. I'll just resend it to you, yeah. Maybe what I'll have to do is attach it in 2 different groups. But can you tell me this, Brittany, does anything appear as attached? Are there files that you cannot open that are attached, or there's just no attachments included at all? Yeah. Yeah, Ryan, you just emailed me, though, like 3 minutes ago, right? Isn't that the case? Correct? Okay, yeah. I'll try and send the attachments again, Brittany. I haven't had too many issues with it. In general, that's how I've been replying to students with the midterm. But in your case, I guess not yet. Yeah, don't worry, Brian. After class, then, since you now emailed me, I'll get right back to you with that. Okay, Brittany, we'll get it done after class at 3:45. So just hang in there, and I'll send you a follow-up. Thank you so much. And same to you, Ryan. I'll be with you after class to send you your response. Okay, everyone. So welcome back. Thanks for being here. Notice that I sent the instructions for the second homework assignment. And I did that last week after class. So the due date for that is this week on Thursday by the end of the day. Just looking at my announcements, making sure that that's all clear. Yeah, so the due date for the second homework is April 15th, Thursday, and that's anytime before midnight. So as long as you email me something before the end of the day on Thursday, 12 a.m. Friday, I guess technically is the time, then it'll be on time. And it's homework. The homework problems are page 151 and 152. It's exercise 5-3, and it's letters A through Z. In that section right there, you're going to see 26 different examples, and for each one, the answer is the name of one of the fallacies of relevance that we've studied. So the fallacies of relevance, those are the ones that were reviewed on the last meeting Thursday last week. And there's just one more of those fallacies of relevance that I want to open with today. I sent you guys some supplementary notes on it, though. I tried to help you by sending you some detailed notes on straw man and red herring. But we're going to cover those again to review at the beginning here. So anyway, just to be perfectly clear, your second homework assignment, don't forget it. It's due to me by an email anytime before midnight on Thursday. And you have to simply go through that list, tell me which fallacy of relevance occurs in the given example. There's a few examples in the list where there's no fallacy. So your option for answering is the name of one of the 8 fallacies of relevance or the words no fallacy. But there's only a couple that have no fallacy. And then other than that, people who have interest in learning their grades from other assignments, please just email me and I'll be able to reply to you within no later than 2 days at the most, usually a little faster, to give you your score so I can tell you your score on the midterm, overall, or anything in between. But you do have to email me for that. That's how I like to return the grades. Okay then, so if that's all clear, oh, Elizabeth, what page was it again? Do note the announcement on the Canvas page so you can see the written directions there, which are very clear. But just so you know, while we're here together, it's page 151 and 152 in the textbook. It's exercise 5-3, and it's part 1, A through Z, letters A through Z, okay? And it spans the divide between page 151 and 152. Okay, guys, so thank you. If you have other questions at any time, please let me know. Any kind of comments or whatever are appreciated, and they also go towards keeping your attendance record. Okay, so then let's just quickly do a little review. Right now we're on to chapter 5 in this book. And chapter 5 is all about the concept of fallacies. Fallacies are when arguments have logical flaws or errors, which makes them bad arguments that we should not be persuaded or tricked by, and certainly that we should not ourselves engage in fallacious argument or rhetoric. There are 3 different categories of fallacies that we've studied, or that we will study. The first one were the fallacies of ambiguity. And in that case, the fallacies are based around the idea that there's ambiguous words, sloppy grammar, or confusion between 2 similar concepts. Within the fallacies of ambiguity, there were equivocation. Equivocation is when you have a key term in an argument that's used multiple times, but the meaning changes. Then there was the amphiboly fallacy. That's the fallacy of grammatical ambiguity, where there's some kind of grammatical error or ambiguity in the argument, which makes multiple conclusions possible to draw, and you're not sure which one. Think of the case where there are multiple subjects to whom a given pronoun could attach, but it's not made clear to whom the pronoun does attach. In statements or arguments like that, there's an amphiboly. Let's see. Yeah, like the other day I was actually talking about presidential politics with somebody, and somebody said something along the lines of, like, what did you think of the Trump-Biden debate? And I think someone in response said, oh, I think he won. But obviously, if that's the claim, we don't know what to interpret because Trump and Biden are both he. So saying he won doesn't allow us to determine who was referenced in the grammatically ambiguous statement. Okay, now there's also the accent fallacy. Accent fallacy happens when a meaning of a statement or a word, a statement or an argument changes depending on which word or phrase within it is emphasized or accented. So one example of that would be like the case given in the book where the parent sees the child has burned down the shed, approaches the child and says, why did you do that? I thought I told you never to play with matches. Child replies back by saying, oh, I know that, but I did not play with them per se. I was doing serious scientific research with them. By accenting and emphasizing and leaning on that word playing, the young person is trying to narrow down the meaning of the concept playing with matches beyond what the mother meant. The mother obviously meant don't touch them, don't use them, don't ignite them at all. Now by adding emphasis to playing, she's trying to make it sound as though it's okay to use the matches as long as what you do does not count as playing. Okay, and then there was division and composition. The division fallacy is when we incorrectly assume that the characteristic feature of a group is also a characteristic feature of each member of the group, and that's not always true. As an example, the United States is the wealthiest country in the world. I'm one member of the United States, but that does not mean that I, as an individual part of the system, am one of the wealthiest people in the world. So in that case, we draw a conclusion about the individual part based on a feature which is only seen in the whole of which they are a part. I am visible to the naked eye, and that's clear, but that does not mean that the individual cells within my body are visible to the naked eye, but they are the parts of me. So there would be another division fallacy. Or if somebody thinks that, I don't know, Canadians are nice, and someone's a Canadian, so they infer that that person is nice. It's not necessarily true that just because the cultural reputation of the group is as such that it holds for every member of the same group. My family's loud. That doesn't necessarily mean that I, a member of the family, am loud as an individual. On the other hand, there's composition, okay? And that's just a similar type of fallacy, but in the opposite direction. So with composition, a person erroneously infers that a feature of an individual is also a feature that the whole group that they're a part of has to have, but that's not always true. So with division, we assume from the features of the whole down to the parts. With composition, we begin with an assumption about a feature seen in an individual part of the whole, and then we draw an incorrect inference about the whole from that part. So if I say to you that I'm a doctorate holding professor, which is true, that does not imply that the Vulich family is this family of highly educated doctors and professors. In my case, it's unique with me and the rest of my family. So just because one member has this feature doesn't mean the whole system has it. Or we could say that the rooms in the hotel are small, but that does not necessarily mean that the hotel overall is small. I don't know. Let's see what other examples were in the book on that. Just to kind of be clear and to finalize it. They use the case of salt. They say sodium and chloride are dangerous by themselves, so when they're combined, they must be dangerous. But no, again, sodium chloride is just table salt. It's a scientific name for table salt. So even though the individual component parts of that compound are dangerous and unstable, when they complement each other, they form something that's not unstable or dangerous. Okay, then. So then after that, there were the fallacies of relevance. The fallacies of relevance are all important for the homework that will be due on Thursday because those are the only kind that are used in that homework. So ambiguity fallacies and the ones we'll cover today, unwarranted assumption, they're not related to the homework, but the relevance fallacies are. So fallacies of relevance are called this because within a fallacy of relevance, one or more of the premises is not related to the conclusion, and that's why it lacks the proper support. One fallacy of relevance is the fallacy of, we'll get to it, personal attack, which is also sometimes called ad hominem fallacy. So the personal attack fallacy happens when instead of giving a logical counter-argument to somebody's claim, you directly attack them in personal terms. Like if somebody tried to make the case to you that the border wall is not a very sound policy because it's not going to change the flow of immigration and it's also going to create a humanitarian crisis, and then somebody says, I don't agree with you because, I mean, the breath smells horrible, and a person with that kind of breath definitely doesn't know anything. That would be a personal attack. That's making it personal. It's not about the person's breath. The question is whether or not this is a sound government policy or not. If you don't agree with their argument, you should be able to state reasons why they're wrong. But making it personal and attacking them is irrelevant to the content of what they have said. If I say to you, you make an argument to me that like police interactions with people of color seem to show racial disparities, and I say, oh, well, come on, I mean, you're black, so that's why you think that. I'm not going to listen to you. I would be, again, making a personal attack. I would be referring to your circumstances in a kind of abusive way instead of listening to your argument itself. So we're supposed to direct ourselves towards the person's argument and evidence, not the individual themselves. It doesn't matter who says it, what they look like, smell like, how they're dressed. If you say someone argues to you that like, I don't know, global warming is real because they see the science behind it of climate change, and then you go back and you're like, well, didn't your mom one time get in problems with the law back in her college years, and didn't she get arrested for something? So I mean, you got this mom that's like got a criminal record. I don't think I'm going to listen to you on climate change. That's again personal. It's not relevant at all to bring up the circumstances of the person's family or past when we're having a completely separate topic discussion. So personal attack, keep things above board. Don't take the bait. Don't get in the gutter with someone else that starts slinging mud at you. Just tell them that that's a personal attack and that's not really related to the argument. Okay, after that, we talked about scare tactics, also known as appeal to force. Appeal to force, aka scare tactic, that is when you use or threaten to use force to get a person to back down from their view or to accept your position. Sometimes the force that's been mentioned here is psychological, emotional, sometimes physical, or even legal. Like if a person says to you, hey, if you want to keep working here, I wouldn't go around mouthing off about your views on that. Or I don't think you should think that if you're going to work here because I don't want employees who believe in climate change, or I don't want employees who believe that the border wall is a bad policy or that it's a good policy or whatever. So if the attempt to silence you into agreement is some implied threat, whether the elimination of favors or benefits or the actual application of force, whether real or implied, that would be a scare tactic. You're supposed to get people to agree with you because of the force of your evidence and reasoning, not because you hold leverage over them or because you can threaten them in some way. So when people have power over others, they're more apt to use the scare tactic fallacy because they can use whatever leverage they have over another person as the basis for inducing fear if they don't agree with you. So if it's a boss, a parent, authority figure, employer, whatever, then that might be the kind of case where you're going to see a more common appeal to fear. But know also that sometimes when a person tries to warn you of something, the warning can be fair and reasonable. So not like every time a person says, hey, watch out, something bad could happen. That's not always a scare tactic. If they're not saying it in order to get you to agree with their view on something, and if they're not the person who supplies the threat, then it could be just a rational warning like, hey, don't drink and drive because you could get into an accident. That's not a scare tactic. That's just a rational assessment of the probable consequences of driving drunk. Okay, next up is appeal to pity. I'm still reviewing the material from last time to kind of get us back into the topic. So what was appeal to pity? And by the way, this is helpful for your homework, so that's another reason I'm doubling over on it. But appeal to pity, that's when a person invokes pity or sympathy, but it's not relevant to the content or the context of the discussion or argument. So like classic cases there could be the police officer that you're begging for a exception to the rule of getting a traffic ticket because of some weak and insignificant appeal to pity, like, oh, I'm dealing with a breakup, or my friend's dog died the other day and it's been a really emotional time for both of us, or whatever the case may be. So if it's some type of appeal to the person's feelings of sympathy and pity, then it may not be relevant in every case, and that could be appeal to pity. Like another case is the professor that's been asked by a student for an extension for an insubstantial reason. So know that you're not supposed to necessarily rely on an emotional appeal to win an argument or to get someone's concession. Then there was popular appeal. Popular appeal is when a person says that something is true or correct just because it's popular or because the majority supports it or believes in it. Like saying, for example, that this movie is the best movie because it's #1 at the box office, or an artist is the best musical artist because they're #1 on the Billboard charts. Obviously, there's more to be said about whether something's good or true than just determining how popular it is. People will do that, though. They'll say, well, look, Apple phones have more sale, more people buy them than Android phones, so they must be better. If they deserve this added popularity and market share that they have, it's because of what the phone is like. It's not because of popularity itself, which of course doesn't exist until it hits the market. So you would want to defend the view that you have that something's true or correct with evidence in favor of it, not just pointing out that it's popular. Why does it deserve the popularity that it has? Then you would have to refer to its features, its suitability for your needs, and all of that. Okay. Appeal to ignorance. Appeal to ignorance is when a person argues that something is true just because no one has proven that it's false. Like if I say to you, aliens exist because you can't prove that they don't exist, that would be an appeal to ignorance. That's not real proof that they exist. That's just pointing out that the opposite has not been disproven. And so to actually have evidence in favor of that, you'd have to have some basic reasons that support the existence of aliens, not merely the lack of absolute disproof. If I say to you that I think you're stockpiling weapons because you can't prove to me that you're not, that would be another instance of the appeal to ignorance fallacy, where I'm trying to say that I suppose it's true just because I have no evidence to the contrary. The only exception, I guess, to this principle of appeal to ignorance is in the legal context, when we grant the presumption of innocence to a person accused of a crime in court. Even though we do that in law because we don't want to give the state such power to detain and jail us without overwhelming evidence, so we put the burden of proof on the prosecution. That doesn't mean that in everyday life we should just assume things are true unless proven otherwise. Like, hey, I assume that this person's cheating on me unless they can prove that they're not. Or I assume that, aliens exist until people can prove that they don't. So in general, we have to have actual proof, not just the absence of contrary evidence. Okay. And then there was hasty generalization. Hasty generalization is when a person jumps to a general conclusion, a universal statement, but they do so based on a limited sample size that's either not big enough or not representative. Like if I say to you that, women are all disloyal because my mom cheated on my dad and then I had a relationship with a woman and she cheated on me, so based on those two cases, I will say all women are cheaters. They're not loyal. But that, of course, would not be a fair thing to say based on 2 example cases. To say such a sweeping general claim about all women based on a few cases would not be fair. Just as much as with men, you could say, well, one man was an abuser, another man was an abuser, so I think all men are abusive. Sometimes the problem is not just the limited amount of cases that are used as evidence for hasty generalization, but the unrepresentative nature of the sample that you have. Suppose that a person has friends in college that are all firearm enthusiasts. These guys are into guns. And so he says, I believe that college students love guns because looking at myself, me and my friends were all into it in college. Well, you know, your own friends, in a way, reflect your own interests. It's a self-selected group, so it's not exactly a statistically normal sample of college students. So it might not be a reflection on the overall tendencies, preferences, or beliefs of all college students if your sample is limited to your own group, which, of course, are going to dovetail with your own interests and values. Okay, and 2 more. There was straw man. Okay, straw man is a fallacy that happens when you misrepresent your opponent's argument, and you do it in order to try and make it seem easier to defeat the argument. So, like, say a person makes the case that our drug laws really should not punish marijuana in the same way that they do crack cocaine or heroin because it's not a narcotic, it's not as addictive, and it doesn't have the same kind of impairment. And then the person says, okay, so what you're saying is legalize every drug? How crazy is that argument? Do you really want people in school just smoking crack, and do you really want people to be able to just go around in society with those kind of drugs coursing through their veins, knowing that they might commit terrible crimes or become volatile? So that's a terrible argument. But look, that way of replying to the initial argument misrepresents what they said. The person didn't argue for the legalization of all drugs, but just for marijuana, let's suppose. If that was the way the opponent replied back, then they would be distorting the original argument to make it seem more radical than it actually was. Or what if somebody said, genetically modified crops, they gotta go. They're not ecologically sustainable, and you know, that's not the best method of agricultural production. And somebody says back to them, okay, so wait, what you mean then is we should just never grow plants, fruits, and vegetables. If we do that, then we're going to all starve. So that's a terrible argument. But again, it's a straw man here because the person didn't really argue that. They said just one method of agricultural production should be modified, not that we should eliminate it altogether. Or what if, I'll give you one more. A person says we need to reduce carbon emissions because global warming has been measured and shown, and it's increasing because of carbon that's collecting in the Earth's atmosphere. And somebody says, okay, wait, so what you're saying is we should just get rid of all forms of energy production. If we do that, what, are we going to live like cavemen? We're going to sit here without cars, without transportation, without mass transit. So clearly your argument's terrible. But once again, that would be a straw man response because the person initially did not say let us eliminate all forms of energy production, but rather let us curtail the amount of carbon emissions that we do with our energy production methods. So why they call that straw man is because when you have a person's real argument and then you misrepresent what they said, you're not attacking the actual person's argument, but this fake version of what they said. In real life, a straw man is like a scarecrow, a man made out of straw, not a real person, obviously. So it's a metaphor. When you over-sensationalize or oversimplify your opponent's position to make it seem easier to reject it, you're not dealing with the real person's view, but with this made-up straw man version of it. So it's like you're dealing with this zombie scarecrow version of what the real person said. And when someone does that to you, you have to direct them back to your actual argument. Say, I don't know, that's a straw man. I didn't say that. Let's deal with what I actually said. So try to be charitable to your opponents when you engage in debate and dialogue. Try and take their argument in the best possible light so that you don't mischaracterize them and get accused of straw man. Okay, and then one more was the red herring, and that's one that I did not get to cover at the tail end of the last lecture. So now I'll have a little moment to talk about it. One more fallacy of relevance, red herring. Okay, so the red herring fallacy it's this. It's when you try to sidetrack an argument by bringing up a different unrelated issue or topic. Okay, so here's that. Sidetracking an argument. sidetracking the argument by bringing up a different, unrelated issue, or we could say topic. So it's really not a difference to me, but I'll use both words. Another issue or topic. So sometimes people try to distract from the main topic of discussion or debate, and that's a red herring. Suppose, for example, someone argues that, hey, don't you think that we have a real problem with with climate change, the way that greenhouse gases are accumulating and causing the planet to heat up? And the person they're talking to says this: no, I don't agree at all. I don't think so. That's wrong. It's not a problem, because the real problem is terrorism. Have you looked at terrorism? I mean, that's what we got to deal with. That's the real issue. Well, what's wrong with this response? They're trying to direct attention away from the original topic of debate to something completely different. Terrorism and global warming are not related at all. So how is this an effective reply? The person has not said why global warming is not a problem. They haven't said why they don't agree with that claim. Instead, they're simply bringing up something else that's a problem in the world, but that does not in any way undermine the initial position of the first person's argument. Like if a person says to you, suppose someone came up and slapped you or something, right? And you're like, what are you doing? You have no right to do that. Get away from me. And the person says, come on, you really shouldn't be complaining. I mean, I know I'm slapping you, but you know, there's a lot of people in this world that they'll just walk up to a stranger and shoot him and kill him, and then they're dead. So you should be happy that I just slapped you. Now, obviously, that's a red herring, because they're bringing up a separate type of violation of a person, which is perhaps worse, yes, but that doesn't in any way excuse or justify the thing that they actually did. So it's sidetracking us away from the topic at hand, which is whether it's right or not for the person to engage in the action that they did engage in. Let me give you some more examples that we see from the book. Someone says, hey, why are you drinking and driving? Can I tell you my argument? It's bad to drink and drive because when you do it, you're impaired, and it would be very easy with that impairment for you to cause an accident, cause an injury to yourself, to other people, property damage, get into legal trouble. For all these reasons, therefore, you should not drink and drive. And now suppose the person comes back and says this: don't tell me I shouldn't drink and drive. Are you kidding? Look at all the people out there that are using the phone texting and driving. So how is drinking and driving a problem? It's not. Okay, isn't that a red herring though? Because what are they doing? They're trying to direct attention away from the question whether it's okay or whether it's dangerous to drink and drive towards a separate topic. They're bringing up the fact that there are other things that people do while they're on the road that are also dangerous while driving. But that does not at all eliminate the force of the argument that it's dangerous on its own to drink and drive. In politics, sometimes there's been a common phrase that I've heard in the last few years, the phrase known as whataboutism. And so that's kind of just another terminology that is sometimes used in politics and media for this phenomenon of red herring. Take the former president, right? And some of the debates that he was in with Hillary Clinton as an example. Classic example of red herring that gets mentioned often would be like, say Hillary would say to him that the border wall is an expensive project that's really not going to lead to any improvement on our immigration status quo. And then he comes back and says, you know what about your emails? Get out of here. Don't tell me my policies are bad, because someone needs to look at your emails. That's an issue that I think we all really want to look at. Okay, well, her emails, it's a whole different problem than any of these policy debates that we could be debating. So to try and reject a tough question about your own policy and whether it's the right solution by raising something else that has nothing to do with the question, that would be a red herring. And I mean, this could happen on either side, right? You can imagine that a person from the other side of the political spectrum engages in a red herring, like they're asked like about a scandal that they've got, right? So someone says, hey, what about this scandal? Don't you owe the voters an explanation of that? And then they just pivot right away from it. They say, oh, well, you know what? No, I don't think that's a problem, because the real problem in this country is how working people are not being treated right and how they're not getting enough take-home pay. So no, my scandal's not a problem. What I'm concerned about are the working American men and women of this country. But that's a change of topic, right? That's changing the issue to, you know, an economic argument for policy movements that we haven't done yet, but it's not at all addressing the question of the reporter or whoever that's talking about the scandal. So red herring. Why do they call it red herring? Last thing is this. Maybe just two more things, okay? So it's called red herring because of a reference to a tactic that would be used to train foxhounds and bloodhounds that you use to help you hunt. Okay, so in England, this is a tactic that's been used for a long time, and I think it's still sometimes used today in other parts of the world. Say you're out there and you're a hunter. So you take a shot at like a deer or some pheasant that's down there 100 yards away. You hit it, it falls to the ground, it's dead. Now you want to get this dog that's with you to retrieve it and bring it back. So to fetch the prey and retrieve it back to the hunter. Well, to make these dogs very effective and skilled at that, what they would do is bring out these herrings. So what is an actual herring? A herring is a little smelly fish, very smelly little red herring. So they would bring like a pack of herrings, and they would do this. They would set the herrings off at like diagonal tangents away from the main line forward to the fallen prey of the hunter. And what they were trying to do is see this. This is what they were wondering. Will the dog be distracted by the powerful smell of these herrings so that it diverts away from tracking the main target, gets distracted by the herring, and goes over and focuses on it? Now, when they're not very well trained yet, then these herrings will distract them. The powerful scent, they'll notice it, and they'll lose sight or interest in the thing that they're really supposed to be targeting and retrieving. But when they're very well trained, then they learn to ignore the red herrings and not to allow them to distract them from the main point, which is getting to the target that they're trying to bring back to the hunter. Now, this is kind of a metaphor, but if you can follow the metaphor, here's what it means in terms of logic and argument. When you're dealing with debate and discussion with other people, there's a main topic of debate or discussion. And when a person drops a red herring, it's like the same where you're the dog and they're trying to distract you with this side tangential issues that are not directly related to what you're debating. So you have to be like that good, well-trained dog that doesn't take the bait or doesn't get thrown off by the scent of the red herring, and instead focuses on the original topic. And when people make a red herring argument to you, you have to be willing to say, I'm sorry, but that's a red herring. Let's focus on the one thing. We can do one thing at a time, and then we can talk about that other issue later if you want. Another area where I have seen red herring used is in criticisms of U.S. policy, and then the person that defends the status quo of the U.S. will report that there are other countries that do even worse things. You know, so someone could say like, oh, these police interactions with people of color, it receives a lot of media attention, but I don't think it's a big deal, because have you looked how in other countries, if you even stand up and say anything to a police officer, they're going to beat you, kill you, throw you in jail, you have no rights. So if I could be killed in the street just for saying that I don't agree with the government policy in some authoritarian country, then I shouldn't be complaining about the harsh treatment that some police officers have here. That would be another red herring, because it's trying to shift attention away from our own domestic problems and mismanagement to the perhaps even more gross abuses that exist in other parts of the world. But just because other countries have problems, maybe some more significant than ours, that doesn't eliminate any kind of argument that says we should reform our status quo to get to a better relation between people and the public and the police. Okay, so we finished then with the last group. I wanted to make sure not to go on beyond that too fast, because since it's all about your homework, those fallacies of relevance, wanted it to really sink in and give you as much on it as possible. But now we can continue to the third and final group of fallacies. We have 2 meetings this week, so there's really no rush. That's kind of why I'm not in any real rush right now. We can use the rest of today and whatever additional time we need on Thursday to finish the discussion of the remaining fallacies of unwarranted assumption. So then, let's go ahead and get into this last group. These are the fallacies of unwarranted assumption. Okay, so in our class, we have a total of 3 categories of fallacies. We've got fallacies of ambiguity, relevance, and now the third, unwarranted assumption. And the category of this, here's the definition. Fallacies of unwarranted assumption are when the argument includes an assumption that is not supported by evidence. Okay, so when an argument includes an assumption that's not supported by evidence, that's when it has a fallacy of unwarranted assumption. Unwarranted means unjustified. So this group of fallacies are named as such because they include assumptions, things that someone is just assuming, but they're not justified to assume those things. So there's something about the evidence that has been assumed, but that is not known. And there are 7 different individual members of this category. So now that we see the definition, I'm going to list the 7 members. And we'll go over them in order from first to last. So the 7 fallacies of unwarranted assumption are these. We've got begging the question, okay, begging the question. Then there's inappropriate appeal to authority. Okay, loaded question. False dilemma. Questionable cause. Okay, slippery slope. And then one more after that. And the last one is called the naturalistic fallacy. Okay, so here are the 7 items to really fill in our agenda for today. We're going to try and discuss and explain the 7 fallacies of unwarranted assumption that you see here. So, begging the question, inappropriate appeal to authority, loaded question, false dilemma, questionable cause, slippery slope, and then the 7th one, naturalistic fallacy. So that's just the scope of our mission to get through these, but we're going to start at the top and go one by one. So I'm starting with begging the question, so I'll clear the board and we'll deal with the others after that. Okay. So begging the question, what is this? With the begging the question fallacy, one of the premises of the argument is simply a reworded version of the conclusion. Okay, so begging the question. When one of the premises of the argument is just a reworded version, like changing the word slightly, but it's the same thing, reworded version of the conclusion. Okay, so when one of the premises of that argument is a reworded version of that conclusion. So let's remind ourselves about what arguments really are fundamentally. With every argument, you have a conclusion that you're trying to claim as true, and you give the premises as the evidence that's supposed to back up and support that conclusion. It's the support. But you could not have the premise be the same thing as the conclusion, because then the conclusion is supporting itself, but that's obviously circular. If I tell you that, let's see, the Lakers are the best team, and you ask me, well, why do you think that? Can you give me an argument? And I just say, well, they're the best team because they are the best team, so therefore they're the best team. Doesn't that sound like a bad argument to you? Because I'm not really giving you any reasons. I'm just repeating the conclusion, and I'm saying that's the evidence too. Because why are they the best? Oh, because they are the best. That's not a good argument. It's what we call a circular argument. So begging the question is sometimes called the fallacy of circular argument because it's an argument that does go in a circle. With a conclusion, you're directed towards the premises which support it. But if the premises are the same as the conclusion, then the argument is both based on itself and trying to make the conclusion of the claim itself. So it's a circular argument. Let me give you some examples, and some of these are shown in the book. Okay, so here's one from the book. Suppose the conclusion of this argument is that capital punishment is wrong. Okay, capital punishment's wrong. That's what the person wants to prove or convince you of. Capital punishment is wrong. Okay, now suppose you hear the person's position that capital punishment is wrong, and now you just want to follow up and ask, why? Why do you think that it's wrong? Give me a reason. Give me an argument so that I can consider your argument. Okay, so a person says, you want an argument? Okay, here it is. So capital punishment is wrong. Why? Because it's immoral. It is immoral for the state to impose death as a penalty. Okay, but let's really look at this argument here and think about it. So as you can see, it says, it is immoral for the state to impose death as a penalty. So therefore, capital punishment is wrong. But let's examine this a little more carefully. What is capital punishment? Can anybody tell me what capital punishment means? What's the definition of capital punishment? Maybe you know, maybe you can tell me. Or even if you have a guess. It's perhaps a word that you've seen or heard kicking around somewhere. If you had to guess, what do you think is capital punishment? It is the death sentence, right? It's the death penalty. It's to impose death as a penalty by the state. That's capital punishment. Now, what's another synonym for something being wrong? If something's wrong morally, right? Then that means that what? Another way of saying wrong, something being wrong, is to say that it's what? See if you can follow my inquiry here. In case you say something is wrong, you could have said it differently with a synonym, and you could have put it how? So we got that capital punishment is a death sentence, yes, or the death penalty. What is another word for something being wrong? Immoral, yes, Brittany, correct. So what this says then is basically that capital punishment is wrong because capital punishment is wrong. This may look as though it's a different piece of information, but it's not. It's just a different way of saying the same. So if it's immoral for the state to impose death as a penalty, that just means capital punishment is wrong. But look, we're left begging the question, meaning the question still is hanging out there. Why though? Why is it wrong? You can't say it's wrong because it's wrong, because in that case, you're not offering any independent evidence for it. What if you went and walked into court and the lawyer was up there and they said, my defendant, my client rather, is innocent, and you're waiting for them to give an argument, and they just stand up there and they're like, I'll tell you why they're innocent, because this man is not guilty. You'd be there and you'd be like, okay, but the question remains, why or what evidence is there that shows that they're not guilty? If the evidence is just a repetition of the claim itself, then you really have not been given any kind of grounds. So those are begging the question, circular arguments. Now, I don't want you to think, though, that this is a bad conclusion. Just because this argument is circular does not mean that there couldn't be good arguments that capital punishment is wrong. Without presupposing one way or the other, I know that there are many people who don't believe in capital punishment. Like, for example, even our governor in California, Gavin Newsom, he's placed a moratorium on application of the death penalty because he has moral objections to it. Even I think President Biden, according to his Catholic faith, is morally opposed to the death penalty, although he doesn't have the power to strike it down on his own. But anyway, there are moral arguments that can be made towards this conclusion that don't beg the question. One of them you could say is that it does not have deterrent power. You could say that, like, okay, compare jurisdictions where there is the death penalty against jurisdictions where it doesn't exist, and we don't see a higher incidence of capital crimes in those places which have abolished the death penalty. So it seems like, therefore, we're not actually getting any kind of return on our application of the policy to the public, because in places where we apply it, people are not tending to commit these type of crimes less, so it doesn't have any deterrent effect. That's one argument, just among many others. But I'm just trying to mention here that I'm not picking on this conclusion. It's a valid conclusion, or I don't want to use the word valid, but it's a reasonable conclusion that could be supported by a non-circular argument, but this argument's circular. Okay, let me give you a few more examples before we just continue on to the next. How about this one? I tell you that the Lakers are the best team in basketball, and you want to hear my sports analyst argument. Why do you think that? Tell me why. And I say this. I say, okay, well, look at the teams in the league. There's 30 of them. And all the other 29 teams, they're not as good as the Lakers. So therefore, the Lakers are the best. Now, what did I just there say? To say that they're the best is logically equivalent to saying that all the other teams are worst. Better than, not as good as. These are just relations that two things can have. So if the Lakers are the best, that's just the same thing as saying that none of the other teams are as good. But I haven't yet given any evidence or reasons as to why I've reached that conclusion. Why are the other teams not as good? Why do you think they're the best? If I just say they're the best because they're the best, I haven't given a reason. But I could give reasons towards that conclusion if I made a credible argument. Like I could say that the Lakers are a historically successful franchise. They have what's widely regarded as the best player in basketball, LeBron James. They're the defending champions. So therefore, they're the best team in basketball. But notice that I didn't just say they're the best because nobody else is just as good. That would have been a circular argument that begs the question. And just another case from the book before I really move on all the way. Maybe just two more because I like to be thorough. Let's look at this argument. This is one that the book mentions too. So suppose the conclusion here is that God exists. A widespread belief that many people have. No problem with that. But suppose that the argument that they give is this. First premise, God wrote the Bible. Second premise, the Bible says God exists. And so therefore, God exists. Now with this one, can you spot the premise that assumes the conclusion? So one of these two premises is already assuming the conclusion is true before we get there. So it begs the question. Can you kind of inspect the argument and tell me which premise, number 1 or 2, is already assuming that God exists? So it basically begs the question of the conclusion. It assumes what the conclusion says before the conclusion. Which one of those premises at least implies that God exists? Correct, Philip. It's number 1. Because what does number 1 say? It says, who wrote the Bible? It says God wrote the Bible. But in order for something to write a Bible or anything, it has to exist. So you can't write a Bible if you're non-existent. So what this already says is that God existed when he wrote the Bible. And a couple steps later, we get this conclusion that God exists. But it's already been assumed in the initial premise. The conclusion has been assumed before the conclusion is arrived at the bottom. And once again, as I've said before, no problem with the conclusion. There are good arguments that God exists. In intro to philosophy classes, I have to teach those sometimes. So one of them is the cosmological argument, which tries to prove that God exists because everything has to have a cause and the universe has to have a cause. But there can't be an infinity of causes because that would be impossible. So there must be a first being, that's the being called God. Another argument, ontological argument. The argument from design. There's many arguments that purport to try and prove the case that God exists. Those are debatable. People can disagree or agree with them. But this would not be a good member of such arguments because in this case, it's a circular argument that begs the question, with the first premise already assuming the conclusion below. As it says in the book, here the conclusion God exists is already assumed to be true in the premise that the Bible is the Word of God. To offer a rational argument for God, we cannot assume in the premise the existence of what we are trying to prove. Okay, and one more to be totally comprehensive. So suppose that the argument has this conclusion, that abortion is wrong. And, if someone tells you that's their view and you ask them, well, why do you think so? What's the reason that you think that abortion is wrong? And they give you this kind of argument. They say, well, it's wrong because it is immoral for a woman to terminate her pregnancy. Now, even though this looks like it's an argument where the conclusion is a different sentence than the premise is, it's really not different. Because ask yourself, we already said this. What is it to be wrong? Well, another word for something being wrong is to say it's immoral. Okay. Well, what's a more fulsome description of what abortion is specifically? What abortion is to intentionally terminate a woman's pregnancy. So what this says is that abortion is wrong because it's wrong to get an abortion, but that again is not a non-circular argument. And in ethics literature, there are reasonable arguments on both sides for and against the legal permissibility of abortion. Of course, within our legal system, the arguments in favor of it have won out, but people can make rational arguments that abortion is wrong. Some people might say that when you have a genetic human being that has the full genetic information of both parents, then it has the status of a person, it has a right to life, therefore abortion is wrong, or something like that. That would be a genetic argument about conception being the marker of when you have full rights, and that could be an argument given. But in this case anyway, it's not a very sophisticated argument because it doesn't give you any reasons beyond just saying it's wrong because it's wrong. Okay, so that's begging the question, everybody, and now we are good on that, I think. So let's go from there to the next. And as it says in the book, begging the question fallacy can be very frustrating if we fail to recognize it, since there's no way to disprove the conclusion if you accept the premise. So if you think an argument contains this fallacy, try reversing the conclusion in the premise to see if the argument will say essentially the same thing. Okay then, so next then, let's go to inappropriate appeal to authority. That's the second member of this list. Okay, so with inappropriate appeal to authority, this fallacy happens when you appeal to the view of an authority to support your argument or conclusion, but the problem is that this person is not an authority or an expert in that field or on that subject matter. Okay, so when we appeal to the view of and I'm going to put this in scare quotes because it's like a false authority, but when we appeal to the view of an authority to support our conclusion, but, and this is the issue, but this person is not an authority on the topic or subject. Okay, so sometimes people like to try and justify their views by mentioning that some other person agrees with them or believes the same thing. And the problem with that type of appeal, though, is when you cite the view of an individual who is in no way an expert on the given topic itself. So suppose that you know, you were hanging out talking to your auto mechanic, or you're getting like a repair work done for your car. And you talk to the auto mechanic, and the auto mechanic is like, hey, you know, why are you wearing a mask? You believe all that stuff that they're saying over there at the CDC? Come on, man, this is totally false. They just want to sell vaccines, or it's a big kind of cover up. I heard that these masks are actually bad for you. They're going to get you sick and, you know, cause you to have more irritation and get even sicker than if you didn't wear them. So I think it's funny you're wearing those masks. And so you take it to heart and you say to somebody else, you know what, I don't think masks and stuff are effective at preventing this vaccine from transmitting because I talked to my mechanic and they don't think that, so that's why I believe it. Now, what's the issue here is that this person's an auto mechanic. So no disrespect to auto mechanics because they do have a lot of expertise and knowledge within the field of automotive mechanics, but not in general. So unless this person is some type of infectious disease expert with scientific credentials, then that's not the right type of authority to refer to in giving some kind of claim or evidence that you're against the masks and social distancing. I think it's funny too, you know, because people are so skeptical of the authoritative viewpoints of actual experts in certain scientific fields. Like you have a guy that's talking to you who's got a lifetime of career experience, super credentialed and qualified within medical or professional or scientific arena. And you don't listen to them, but you listen to other people that have no expertise or knowledge at all, which is getting things completely backwards. So when you cite a false authority, it's an inappropriate appeal to authority. The book gives another example. It says like, hey, my priest told me that there's no such, sorry, let me get it right. My priest says all genetic engineering is not safe, so therefore I think we should stop experimenting in that field. And as the book mentions, unless your priest is also an expert in genetic engineering, before accepting the argument as correct, you should ask him for reliable and authoritative evidence for their assertion. Sometimes we also see the inappropriate appeal to authority with celebrities and popular endorsement figures for products and services. I saw an ad recently for some type of mental health clinical support and application that helps people with those problems, but it was the endorsement figure was Michael Phelps, the famous Olympian swimmer. This man, I would certainly think he's a good person to talk to if you need any tips on swimming form or how to train for athletic competition. He's an expert for that, yes. But in no way do I think that he's necessarily the first person I would have wanted to listen to if I was hearing advice about how to diagnose and treat mental health issues. I want to hear it from a clinician or a physician. There's this famous physicist, Michio Kaku, who he's kind of one of those science figures that popularizes science to a mass audience, like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye. He talks a lot about really far out, weird, trippy stuff in quantum physics and things like that. He has a lot of popular books and he's done a lot of media appearances. But anyway, he got somehow involved in sponsoring a financial planning application a couple years back. And the whole commercial was just, be smart like this guy and use our investment planning app. But he's not a financial specialist. He's not a stockbroker or an investment portfolio financial planner. So just because he's telling me to do it, I think his field of expertise is within the realm of science and physics, not necessarily investment and the stock market. So again, it could be an inappropriate appeal to authority. Sometimes because people have distinguished titles in other areas, we falsely assume that they could be a credible authority on anything. Me, for example, I have a PhD, so I have the title of doctor. And I do have a PhD in philosophy, so I know a lot about philosophy. I could teach you pretty much anything in the entire historical time period between the ancient Greeks up till the current day, teach you ethics, logic, critical thinking like I'm doing here. And I know a lot about that stuff. But just because I'm an expert on philosophy, logic, etc., and the history of philosophy, that doesn't mean that I'm an expert in other academic disciplines. True story, I was really bad in high school at chemistry. That was my worst subject ever. I hated it. To this day, it's still confusing to me. And I got like a D. That was my worst ever academic performance in a single class. So as soon as I finished that, I guess that technically did not count as failing. I never touched it again. Stayed far away from it in college. But anyway, chemistry is cool and interesting. It's just hard. So if you come back to your parents or someone else and you're like, hey, Professor Vulich, my Dr. Vulich, this philosophy professor who teaches me, he told me that helium is like one of the heaviest elements in the periodic table. And he's a doctor, so he would know, so that's true. You'd be, again, engaged in an inappropriate appeal to authority. My authority and expertise doesn't transfer over into every conceivable academic area of study. And so we should know that when we sometimes cite people out of their field of expertise, then that could be another case of inappropriate appeal to authority. And it says that in the book. It says, uniforms and distinguished titles like doctor, professor, president, lieutenant can serve to reinforce the mistaken perception that people that are experts in one field must be knowledgeable in others. So if you're like, hey, my English teacher told me that I should sell all my stocks because the stock market is not wise to invest in, you might say, well, an English professor doesn't necessarily have the kind of experience and expertise that makes them a credible source of opinion on that. So some examples all around, guys. Hopefully that's clear. So to avoid an appropriate appeal to authority, just check an expert's credentials in the field that is the subject matter of discussion before using their testimony as authoritative. Okay, so we're good to go on an inappropriate appeal to authority. And now we're going to move to what's called loaded question, okay? Okay, so the loaded question fallacy is this. This one I think is pretty easy to explain and to understand. Loaded question happens when the person asks a question, but the problem is that they ask a question which assumes something that they don't know. So it's like when you ask a leading question, when you ask one of those loaded questions that assumes the answer to a different question that you did not ask. So I'll put the definition and then I'll try and explain a little. When you ask a question that assumes an answer to a different question that you did not ask. To a different unasked question. You ask a question that assumes an answer to a different question that was not asked. Okay, so when these questions get posed, you always can tell that it's a loaded question because it's assuming something that is not known to the question asker. How about this? What if I ask you this? When's the last time you traveled abroad? Like, when's the last time you left the country? That could be a loaded question because what's been assumed in the question? If I don't know you too well, I guess I would have to not know you too well to ask such a question. I'm assuming something in the question itself. When I ask you, when is the last time that you traveled abroad? What am I assuming? How is that a loaded question? I assume the answer to what other question? Or I assume what fact about you that I don't know? So once again, the current example question is, when's the last time that you left the country and traveled somewhere else? Okay, good, Brittany. It assumes that the person has ever traveled abroad. And if you haven't yet gone to another country, then you could not give me an answer. You could not say, oh, a year ago or 3 years ago. You'd have to instead redirect me to the question itself and say, I'm sorry, but that's actually a loaded question. I've never traveled outside of the country, sorry to say. So I can't simply give you an answer. Your question is misplaced. That's one example right there. What if I ask you this? How many pets do you have? Or, you know, that assumes that you have pets. I guess in a way you could say 0. So there's a possibility of giving an answer that's a numeric answer. But what if I ask you, like, let's see. Where did you, oh, how about this? Okay. Who are you dating right now? That's a loaded question in some cases because what's the assumption? Who are you dating? Who's your partner? Loaded question, what's the assumption? I think you know, but I just kind of want to make sure it's coming through and that the understanding is there. So on your end, you'll just report back to me. What's the loaded assumption in this case? When I ask a person, who are you dating? Hopefully not too tough, but do let me know. Yeah, assuming that you're dating somebody, right? So if you're single, you can't say, oh, okay, well, my partner or my boyfriend or my girlfriend, whoever, is this person. So the assumption there is that you're already in a relationship, and I just don't know the identity of the person. I don't know. Sometimes this can happen in law. A common example of this, you say, too many girls around, Ryan? Well, the question was, who are you dating? And it's possible that the person has never dated or that they don't have a relationship right now. So they can't say who it is if there's no such thing. But the assumption of the question is that there is such a thing. And that's why it's a loaded question. Take the case of law. Sometimes law enforcement officers or lawyers will try to rope us into answers that we don't want to give through the force of loaded questions. So how about this? You got pulled over. The officer says, why were you speeding? Now, how's that a loaded question? What's been assumed in the way the question is phrased? Why were you speeding? The assumption of the officer's question is clearly that what? Why are you speeding? Why were you driving beyond the speed limit? What's the loaded assumption of this? Ryan, you say assume in the rush. Ryan, I don't think this is coming through to you quite clearly because we don't have yet information about whether or not the person was in fact doing what. Someone else, please let me know. Or Ryan if you want to. But that's not what I meant, no. The question the officer asks is, why were you speeding? Clearly what is assumed in the question is that the person was what? I'm teeing up a softball for you to just knock out of the park. So go ahead and just take up that baton and tell me. Yeah, the assumption is that the person was speeding, okay? So if you're a person who is driving at the speed limit, when the officer pulls you over and they say, why were you speeding? By saying anything, you're admitting to having sped. In a way, you could say, was I speeding? I don't necessarily agree that I was speeding, so your question itself is wrong. You asked me why I'm speeding, like what was my motive? That assumes that I was speeding, but according to my observation of my speed, I was not actually going beyond the speed limit. Or take the case of lawyering. Suppose that you have a witness on the witness stand, and the lawyer, asks the person, they've pled not guilty, but this is the prosecution, and they say, now that we have you on the witness stand, you have a chance to be honest with us and the jury. So please just tell us all today for the first time, why did you kill the person? Why did you commit murder? Now, if the person has pled not guilty, then of course the loaded assumption of the question is that they are guilty, and the only question is what the motivation behind doing the act was. But if you've denied doing it in the first place, you can't give the reason why you did it because you're claiming that you did not, so that'd be another loaded question. Let me give you one from real life. Maybe sometimes that makes it a little more relatable. So I'll never forget this. It's like a childhood memory. I was hanging out at a friend's house, and there was like a group of us friends that were hanging out at his pad. And, his mom was there kind of supervising the kids and watching us chill and hang out, right? So one of these little friends of our mutual friend at their house had never been there before and didn't really know his mom. The mom of, not amphibly, okay, but he did not know the mom of the individual whose friend it was where we were all hanging out. So anyway, the mom comes in and sees us group of kids chilling and hanging out, and the one kid sees the mom and asks this awkward question that was a loaded question. The question was this: oh wow, when are you? When is the baby due? When are you going to give birth? So the question was, when is this baby going to, be full term and due for birth? Question: when are you going to have that baby? But the problem is, what do you think was the assumption that was too much in this question? Why do you think that was a loaded question? Kid sees the woman, the mother, and says, when is the baby due? What do you think was wrong with that question? How do you think the story ends? How do you think it ends? Yeah, so the assumption was that she was pregnant, and in fact, no, she just had a kind of, that was her body type. She had that type of stomach. So the child asked an inappropriate question: when is the baby due? This is not a pregnant woman. So it was highly offensive, actually. She kind of got upset with the little kid, which in my mind, still remembering it, I didn't think that was nice because, it's a kid, they're naive, they didn't know what they were saying. But anyway, it was like, how rude of you to ask such a question. You're saying that I'm pregnant. I'm not pregnant. Get out of here. That's really wrong. That was inappropriate. So it was a loaded question, and it caused this kind of socially awkward interaction between the people. Yeah, so in general, you want to ask questions, but from a standpoint of knowledge. You don't want to have assumptions built into the question that you don't know about somebody. In other examples, they give the case in the book: do you think the death penalty should only be for people that are above 18? If you ask somebody that, you're assuming that they support the death penalty in general, and the only question is at what point in time should it be applied, or should people be eligible to receive it. But if you don't support the death penalty at all, then you could not say, oh, I think it's only for people over 18, or that it should be for just people in general. Once again, a loaded question. I'm trying to think of other fun examples. I don't know if you have any that you could throw out there into the chat as some examples of loaded questions of your own. How about this? I ask you, do you prefer, when it comes to drinking, do you like beer or wine? That could be a loaded question, because if you just don't drink at all, then you couldn't tell me what your preference is between the two options, because you just abstain from all of it altogether. So anyway, sometimes people ask us questions which assume things that they don't know. If they do that, you have to tell them that's a loaded question and you have to ask a different one, or let me inform you about what you have assumed so that you know. All right, so loaded question, that's done. Any examples though? I wonder, just off of the top of your head. Okay, Stephen, I think that comment was due to arrive much earlier, but now it's popping up in my chat that something about your speeding. Any takers? Give me an example of a loaded question. Ask me something that you don't know. What if somebody says, what's the worst hangover you've ever had? How's that a loaded question? It's a loaded question because it assumes the person has ever had one in the first place. So they're asking you to give like a story, a retelling of the worst. But if it's never happened in the first place, then that would not be a question. Okay, Stephen, yeah, I see that your comments. Well, now it appears that they're going through, so that's good. What if somebody asks you, when did you lose your virginity? That could be a sensitive issue, right? A loaded question. In case the person's still a virgin, then they can't tell you the date and time when they lost virginity because they haven't lost it yet. So that would be an assumption of that question. So I don't know if there's any ability that one has here to give me such an example. It'd be kind of nice. So I'm just kind of delaying for a bit of a moment here to see if anything comes back. Sometimes it's nice to see student examples to make sure that you processed it and that you know it so well that you can actually come back and give me an example that you come up with on your own. Now, Stephen, I don't know if now you're trying to say speeding is the example, but anyway, I feel like we kind of got a little confused with the order of the comments in the stream of the live stream, but now hopefully you're up to speed with us. Sorry for the pun. But yeah, examples, anyone? An example of this isn't that bad. You have to ask a question, but it's got to be a loaded question. Who's your favorite Star Wars character? There you go, Lance. You get it. It's not too bad, not too hard to say. So what you've asked me is who's my favorite Star Wars character, but what if I don't like Star Wars at all? Personally, though, it's Jar Jar Binks. Do you really want to know? So that's who my favorite Star Wars character is, but I know that's not the most popular choice, especially to fans of the franchise. How's the COVID recovery going? Yeah, yeah. So I guess you could ask somebody, what was the worst COVID symptom you've ever experienced? And if they've never had it in the first place, then they couldn't give you an answer on that. So good examples, guys. Good. I'm glad to see that it's coming through. So let's continue. We just have a little more time to try and talk about one or two more. The next one we will speak about is what's called false dilemma. Okay, so false dilemma. This fallacy happens when a person tries to reduces the responses to a complex issue to a binary either-or choice. Okay, so okay, false dilemma. When a person reduces the responses to a complex issue to a binary either-or choice. All right, so sometimes people think in all or nothing terms. And this kind of all or nothing thinking can oftentimes lead to false dilemma fallacy. For example, what if somebody thinks this? They're interested in somebody romantically, and they're thinking this thought, I wonder how they feel about me. Basically, do they love me or do they hate me? I just can't tell. I'm so nervous because I can't tell if they really passionately love me like I love them, or do they just hate me? Now, that's kind of a false dilemma, isn't it? Because saying that they either love you or hate you ignores all kinds of middle ground possibilities. So what are some other possible options besides the person either loving or hating someone? What do you think? So it's possible that the person does not either love or hate, but rather what? Just a question. You heard it though. So if the only two options given are, do they love me or hate me? What possibilities is this ignoring in the middle? Yeah, it could be just indifferent. That's right, Lan. It could be a person who thinks, I don't know, I'm not very passionate on either side. I don't like have some strong, passionate love, nor total hatred and dislike, but it's just meh, just indifferent. No feelings one way or the other. By ignoring that middle ground possibility, the person is illegitimately polarizing the possible options in terms of how you should respond or judge those things. Another case, someone says, America, where do you stand? Do you love it? Or do you want to leave it? I mean, it's love it or leave it, basically. So which one are you? You love this country, or you want to be somewhere else? Obviously, that's another false dilemma. False dilemma. Dilemma is like two things. So it's sometimes called the fallacy of false choice or false dichotomy, but I'm using our book's chosen label of false dilemma. So when someone says, America, love it or leave it, how is that a false dilemma? What's the possible middle ground between loving it or leaving it? Yeah, good. Good, I got both comments there, guys. But my new question is about the love it or leave it example. This only gives us two options, but clearly there's more than that. What can someone do aside from either loving it or leaving it? What do you think? Because you don't have to love it or leave it. You could just what? You could feel mixed. I guess that's one thing. You could put it that way, Oliver. I was thinking kind of like you can have complaints and stay right where you are. Stay right there and keep complaining because you're free to do that. It's a free society. It's a liberal democracy. So thankfully, you don't live in like a totalitarian dictatorship where if you don't act like you love it all the time, you're going to be punished or somehow silenced. In our system, you're free to point out errors, areas where we could improve, policy changes that we can make, and you can urge for their reform. And that's part of being in a society like this. So it's not love it or leave it, really. That shows us only two possible options, but there's all kinds of middle ground. Having, some kind of dose of respect, but at the same time being willing to make criticisms and staying right where you are. Okay, so that's a good point there, Oliver. It's mentioned in the book, America, love it or leave it. That argument makes the unwarranted assumption that the only alternative to accepting U.S. policies is to move to another country. In fact, there are many alternatives, including working to change or improve those policies. In this case, the fallacious reasoning is also reinforced by a one of us, one of them error. Let me think of some other false dilemmas. Sometimes people think in terms of polarities where there's a middle ground. Like what if someone says, I'm not sure where you stand politically. Are you one of those hardcore right-wing nationalists? Or are you one of those like far left liberal socialists? Where is your viewpoint? It's got to be one of those. So just let me know which one it is. In that case, it's a false dilemma because it's characterized as though you've got to be on one of the two political extremes. But doesn't that ignore the middle ground position of being politically moderate or independent or unaffiliated with either of the major parties? I mean, in my own case, as an example, you've got Republicans and Democrats. If someone says to me, which party are you a party of? I would say, well, it's a false dilemma because I'm actually declined to state. I've been a declined to state unaffiliated voter for like 20 years. And when I was first eligible to vote, I was registered as libertarian, but I decided that I wanted to disavow a party label because I want to have, reasonable criticisms of ideas and arguments that are presented on whatever side of the political spectrum that people have. So it would be a false dilemma to try and rope me into one of these two binary options. Sometimes today people talk about assuming one's gender, right? Are you a man or are you a woman? And because of the additional gender categories that some people espouse, in some cases, gender nonconformity means that they don't want to at least express a masculine or a feminine gender norm, then you could argue that, that's a false dilemma. Are you masculine? Are you feminine? Perhaps you're gender neutral or something else. And also, I'll point this out. Sometimes the way that pollsters conduct their surveys can involve the false dilemma fallacy. And when that happens, we should be a little more skeptical about the distribution of public opinion that is reported by the survey. Here's an example in the book. So how the options are presented in the questions can influence the response. For instance, in one survey, people were asked whether they felt that the courts were too harsh or not harsh enough with criminals. So they just give you these two extreme options. Is the courts too harsh or are they not harsh enough? When people were only given those two choices, only 6% said too harsh and 78% said not harsh enough. But when a third option was offered, do not have enough information about the courts to say, 30% chose that response, and only 60% said not harsh enough. So you would have had a totally radically different assessment of what the state of public opinion is if you had relied on the flawed initial survey that presented the options to the survey respondents as a false dilemma. Okay, so to avoid the fallacy of false dilemma, watch out for either or questions that put you on the spot. You know, like if someone says to you, I don't know, do you love me or do you hate me or something? You can say it's a little false dilemma. I don't know if those are the only two choices. Or if somebody says, you know, there's only these two options, take it or leave it. Oftentimes that involves a kind of a implied or explicit false dilemma. If neither alternative is satisfactory, sometimes you got to say it's a false dilemma or just claim I'm not sure if they don't give you any more options. Okay, so false dilemma, everybody. In advertising and marketing, here's another one. Sometimes you'll see a commercial and it'll pop up and it'll show like only two brands that are competitors. So maybe it's like, I don't know, like fast food competition, like McDonald's and Burger King are calling each other out on their commercial. It's like, oh, well, here's the Big Mac and it's way better than a Whopper. As though there's only two choices for you to choose from. And sometimes it'll say like the leading brand against our brand, as though there's only these two to compare against each other, like paper towel ads, and they'll show you like our brand and then one competitor, as though since ours is better than the one competitor, we're better than everybody. Okay, let's go on then. Just a few minutes remain, and so we'll have to finish the last couple of items at the top of the Thursday meeting, and that's no problem at all because we have a whole Thursday meeting to go over that. In fact, I think instead of rushing through them, I'll probably just start to get into our closing comments right now because I want to make sure we're all clear about a few things. So Thursday, you have to submit your second homework assignment by the end of the day, by midnight at the end of the day. So you have the full day Thursday until midnight, and then it's Friday. Just send it as an email to me, to my rvulish@occ.cccd.edu. You can leave it as an attached file. If you have trouble attaching files, just send it to me in the body of the email, but for the most part, it's good to have those attachments. And then next Tuesday, a week from today, we'll have one more, the next quiz, the quiz that is going to be on Chapter 5. That quiz is going to have to do with all 20 of the fallacies from all three groups. The homework is just on the fallacies of relevance. And once you turn in the homework on Thursday, I'll release the answer key over the weekend. So you'll know exactly how you did on it heading into the quiz. And that means that you'll be fully prepared to hopefully do well on the quiz. The quiz is just going to contain examples of fallacious arguments. And in one part, it's going to ask you to give some examples of fallacies which are named. And so you'll both identify fallacies by example and give examples according to the name of the fallacy. And that'll be the way the quiz functions next Tuesday. But Thursday, that's coming up 2 days from now, that's when we'll just review all the 20 fallacies and finish the last 3 or 4 in the unwarranted assumption category. So anyway then, guys, let me know. Is everything okay? If so, then I guess I'll let us head out a few minutes early. I didn't want to rush through a whole definition with just a few minutes left of class time. But to those that haven't yet contacted me for earlier grades, feel free to do it anytime. When you do, I'll be responding to you within 2 days at the most, and I'll get back to you with your grade report and your overall scores if you want them. But let me know in the chat that we're good to go. Okay, perfect. Thank you guys again. Appreciate all of your attendance and contribution to the class. So I'll see you back on Thursday then. Have a good one, and until then, take care. And Brittany, I'll try to resend you those pics. Hopefully there's no issue with you opening the files once I resend them. Okay then, have a good one, guys, and I'll be in touch. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.